So each staff has their own brand, and pretty much each staff has their own dedicated manager. And we're super, super lucky. I mean, we have great staff and great managers. So I don't necessarily, it's very sweet of you to say, how do I manage it all? I manage it all with a ton of help. So the managers are doing a lot of that intermediary communication. The staff is doing a lot of that work, meeting with families or, bringing people into our care, performing the cremations. So we have a pretty good infrastructure. And as people, we don't have a super high turnover. We had a little bit, when the employment market went a little wonky there, kind of right coming out of 2021, had a little bit of turnover of longer term staff members. But for the most part, we've been really, really lucky that people tend to stay for a while. So you can really farm that knowledge and that information, which is helpful on both sides. It's really helpful in the community based business because there are communities that trust a certain counselor who's been there forever, and they can, sort of open doors for younger directors and counselors who are coming in. And then it's also helpful on the online side because even there, you're not necessarily sheltered from some of the gnarlier death stories. And, if a counselor hangs up and it's their first time hearing about something horrendous and awful, another director can go, hey, why don't you walk around the building for 5 minutes? Or, whatever it is that they need to do. They've seen it before, and they can kind of give them advice and coping stuff. So I manage it all with a lot of help is the short answer.
Yeah, that seems to be the general answer when we talk to people who manage. They always compliment their staff.
You really can't do it alone. Yeah, I think we've learned, the generation that came before me, not just in our business, but in I think a lot of funeral home businesses, really, I think, tried to do a lot of it themselves. I could do everything. I could embalm, I could cremate, I could run first calls. And knowing how to do those things, in my mind, is really important and is a source of sense of pride. And, I feel great when I go up to our cemetery and I know how to measure a grave space, or I get in the green burial area and I can help dig a hole. But really, and for a long time, that's how I sort of saw my value as a leader and a manager. And I think it's still good. I think people need to know that there's no job that I'm too good for. But I did start to realize, hey, wait a second, if I'm doing their job, who's doing my job? Who's looking out over the horizon for the company to make sure that they still have jobs in 5 or 10 years? So there was a pretty big mindset shift for me. And part of that's probably maturity. Part of that's probably just realizing that no one was looking out over the horizon. So I think that's another long way of saying you really can't do it alone. I mean, even one person shows need support staff to help them get through stuff. The burnout rate, I think, in our industry is pretty high. I've not really seen numbers, but I would imagine it's pretty high because you throw yourself at this with all you've got. You make connections with the family. You will meet them from the beginning to the end because you've made that connection. Unless you're really building in those barriers and that time to recharge, you're just not going to get it.
Yeah, I definitely, I think you've said a lot of really great things there. I think one of the things that I've tried to learn or had to learn is you really have to, as an owner or as a manager, you really have to understand how to work on the business and not in the business, right? Because if you're doing that, then there's no one, like you said, guiding where you're going to go in the next 5 to 10 years, right? So I think that's super important. I do think that there's a lot of owners and death care providers now that, it's really hard for them to give up that control or like even just trust somebody, especially some of like the older generation. They have this way of, you got to put in your time, you got to work really hard, work yourself to the bone to like come out this better person. And, I think with the changing workforce, and we've had a couple guests that have talked about that, it's a lot different now.
And I think people expect different, as folks are coming out of mortuary school and coming into our funeral homes, we're also seeing that the expectation is different, right? So figuring out how to balance revenue and pricing and expenses, and so that you can provide a job that allows for people to live and work in the same area and also have some sort of quality of life. And there are times, when I look at, like I said, I've only been doing this for about 13 years, but sometimes I'll look at folks who are coming in and I'm like, man, I didn't have all that when I started. And just sort of remembering like, yeah, that's a good thing. Those are changes that you've made that have made it better. And also, there is a hard thing to balance in my mind between, if there's not a challenging work environment for new people coming in, can they appreciate those changes that have made it better? Or does it become an expectation and sort of an entitlement thing? I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I think this is a 24-hour business. And so knowing that whether you're on call from home, I don't know what it looks like in everyone's business, but as people are coming in, one of the first things I say is, this is generally a 24-hour business, and we work really, really hard to make it only an 8-hour business a day for you. But someone is always on the clock 24 hours in this business. And it's just important that you understand that, because you're grateful for your coworkers at that point. You're grateful that, you've only have an 8-hour workday, or if you're working overtime, you get paid overtime. I mean, I guess that's also state laws in California. But so, not sounding like, you're welcome for allowing you to have a personal life, but hey, we've worked really, really hard to make this industry one where you can love coming to work, you can do what you enjoy doing, you can hopefully make a living, and it's, I think, hopefully in some ways gotten better than it was, 20 years ago, or more. It's easier to be balanced than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, the entitlement thing runs deep to the core, even with my
It's a
kids.
hard one.
Like,
Yep.
you have so many advantages now that weren't
Yeah.
available back then.
How old are your kids?
I have currently a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, two boys.
Okay, so we've got a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and then we tripped across the finish line and we have a 11-month-old. So
Oh, okay.
we got two girls and a boy. And working, I mean, that's something that's really important to me with them is, I want them, even at 7 and 5, to understand their value and to not, and obviously you're making it age appropriate conversations, but also the world doesn't necessarily owe you anything.
Mhm.
So you've got to be able to see those opportunities and go for them. And, there are times where it's a sprint and not a marathon. For the most part, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But sometimes, you're talking about owning a business. I'd imagine when you guys started Parting Pro, there was a year or two of sprinting there that you had to do. You had to really hustle. You had to beat the streets. You had to get out there, and you were the guy that everyone wanted to talk to.
Yeah.
And then you had to break away from that and go, all right, we've got to get sales. I mean, I don't know your growth model, but when we come into a market, or if we go into an area, or even, I grew up in the town where our funeral home is centered out of. So a lot of times families will call and ask for me, just whether they know me or they know my family or whatever. And I've had to really try and distance myself a little bit. I always want to come in, I want to say hi, but I have to empower my counselors to do what they do best and what they do sometimes better than me. And then there are times where it's like, nope, I can tell we're losing market share. This other funeral home opened up down the street. They're capitalizing on our weaknesses. I'm going to go out and I'm going to meet with, 5 families every week, because I have to make sure that people know that the value is still here. So knowing when it's a sprint and not a marathon is helpful too.